All right, everyone. Thanks again for your patience. We're going to go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Megan Lenz. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications for Cure SMA. I just want to offer a couple of reminders before we get started. First of all, I want to remind you that the information in this webinar is intended for U.S. audiences only. Secondly, I do want to remind you that as we explained in the registration process, all questions for this webinar needed to be submitted in advance. Now, if you're watching on a desktop, kind of on your right-hand side, you'll see a box called Questions. If you're watching on a mobile device, it's probably at the top or bottom of your screen. We're going to go ahead and keep that question box open. We'll be taking in any questions that we receive. We'll be cataloging them, and we'll be using them to help guide future communications. But when we get to the Q&A portion of this webinar, we will be restricted to answering questions that were submitted in advance. So with those reminders out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kenneth Hobby, the President of Cure SMA.
Welcome, everybody. We're very excited to be hosting this webinar today. And I think what we're going to do is cover an awful lot of information. We're really kind of splitting this up into two parts. And so what we're going to kick off with is we've asked AveXis to come in and actually present to us, present to the community here on this webinar. And then Cure SMA will come in at the end, and myself, Mary Schroth, Jill Jarecki on the line as well. We'll talk a little bit further on some of the future issues that we're looking at as well here. So this webinar is really focused on the Zolgensma approval from the FDA, the very recent kind of approval that came through, and there'll be a lot of information on what went into that approval, what's in the label. And then also we'll start to get into the issues that follow on after approval with access to this treatment, and we'll talk about the treatment sites, the insurance approvals, and then some of the decisions that are going to be important for people to make. So we're very excited to host this webinar, very excited to have AveXis here. We're obviously very excited to have this approval come through for this treatment. And so I wanted to start off just by welcoming the president of AveXis, Dave Lennon, and just to say a couple of opening remarks, and then we'll get into some of the details that we're going to get into. We now are going to talk as Cure SMA on our perspectives, and certainly we'll touch again on some of the same issues when we're talking about what's in the label approved from the FDA, but we'll also talk about some of the broader aspects and making choices, decisions, and what could come in the future as well. So I think a few things to highlight as we get started here. We're talking now particularly about access, what happens after approval and what the key issues are. One of those certainly is the availability of sites of hospitals who know how to care for SMA and then are set up and ready to dose Zolgensma. We think we're doing pretty well in this area already, but we'll highlight kind of what's going on there. The real issue that I think then we're focused on is the insurance aspect, the coverage that'll come in to cover the costs of Zolgensma and the policies that are going to come out, what we're doing there, how that's going to kind of advance over the next couple of months. I think as well it's important to really be talking about data as we go throughout this. What data is available now from the trials, what's coming later, how that's evaluated, not so much just by the FDA, but the insurance companies, and I think importantly, us as a community as well, when we now are making choices and there's options out there. What we did see from the FDA, I think, was a very good result. We were very pleased here again with the FDA that they came in and did something which is broader than the clinical trial criteria. This is not what they often do. Usually the approval for a treatment matches the criteria from a clinical trial. And here again in SMA, because of how the FDA is being engaged with the community, how they look at SMA as a disease, they went broader, and we'll highlight specifically what that is. But that's a very good thing that we'd like to see from the FDA. What we'll touch on a little bit towards the end of this presentation is really the brand new topic that's come up, and I think it's an area that we don't have a lot of information on yet. We will be talking more about this at the conference that's coming up, and other opportunities like the local summits of strength as well, when we're talking about sequential treatment and also potentially combinations as well. So to start off with, we're going to just touch on treatment sites. And so we do have a list available now, and this information is available on our website, and you can email us as well at treatments@curesma.org, and we'll have all these links available at the end of this presentation, where these are sites that have said they've consented to be publicly listed. They're available, they're up and running, dosing with Zolgensma. And so we've actually moved pretty rapidly. We see now that we've got about 31 sites who are saying they're ready to be publicly listed. There are more sites that are dosing than we've got here, and we're working with them to get them comfortable and be available for additional patients to contact. So this, we think, is pretty good so far. Up to 21 states are covered. We are updating this all the time, so definitely we'll update the website, but email us as well if you have questions, if there's local hospitals that you want to find out if they're dosing as well. We think that, if we can get up to maybe between 50 to 100 sites who are, again, caring for SMA, but also dosing Zolgensma, that should be a good capacity for what we'll need going forward. So that's what we're working to initially, and then we'll monitor that over time. So to highlight here again, what we're talking about when we say in label for Zolgensma, this is the IV delivery approach. This is the approach, the intravenous, which puts the gene therapy throughout the whole body. We'll talk about the intrathecal a little bit, but this here, the label is the intravenous. The approvals come through critically. The key thing to know is that under 2 years of age, along with there being then no restrictions when we're talking about the copy number, SMN2, and then also the types of SMA as well. It's covering all types, all copy numbers, but this specific item is under 2 years of age. We're just going to show 2 slides here quickly, which are, I think, 2 slides which really kind of summarize very well the clinical trial information, the data that has come out from those initial clinical trials. What we're going to highlight as well is all of this information about the clinical trials that are done so far, the information that's being presented. They're all on our website, much more than just the 2 slides that we're going to show here. And so, Mary, if you just want to maybe give a quick overview of these initial slides, some of the summary data.
So the summary data is showing us, the first slide talks about the probability of permanent ventilation, with the green line being the participants in the clinical trial, and then the red and the blue lines are natural history, what typically occurs with SMA that's untreated with these therapies. And the second one shows us the CHOP-INTEND scores, which is a measure of motor function, and how the participants in the START trial, the very first clinical trial for Zolgensma, how they're doing. So these results are very impressive. It still reminds us that this is not a cure. Individuals with SMA still have symptoms of SMA. This slide demonstrates that the milestones that were achieved through following treatment with Zolgensma maintained over time. After over 3.5 years after treatment with Zolgensma, motor milestones that were achieved have continued. There's not been any loss of function over time, which is so incredibly impressive.
So the next slide, and Mary will keep going with this. I think we wanted to highlight these are areas which actually are included in the FDA label, but they're kind of highlighted in what we'd maybe say these are more kind of gray areas to really kind of pay attention to, especially when we start kind of looking at the difference from the FDA label to what the insurance policies are going to cover. Yeah.
Information is not available about Zolgensma in these situations. Zolgensma is given once. It's also not been used in individuals with SMA who are dependent on ventilators or respiratory support. Also, just to note that it should not be used in premature infants, and that's because there's been some data demonstrating that if you use corticosteroids in premature infants, there's concerns about neurologic development over time. So it's recommended not to use it in anyone who's premature.
So with this next slide, I think what we're trying to highlight is specifically the difference between the criteria that were in the clinical trials for this IV approach, the difference between that and actually what was approved from the FDA, what's in the FDA label. And again, we look at that as broader, that it is a good result that the FDA's gone beyond just the criteria in the trial. But then our question now is going to be specifically, where do the insurance coverage policies, when they come out, land? Are they going to match the FDA label, which is what we're always going to be pushing for? Are they going to be, more restrictive than the label and try to match up with the criteria, which can be an expectation as well and something that we're going to be pushing back on? And they could be in between. So this is what we're going to be watching for in kind of the next critical stage for us in working with the insurance providers. So the clinical trial data that you've heard, and again, you can see more of this on the website, when we're talking about the IV clinical trials, really the critical part to know is the criteria there were under 9 months of age at the time of dosing and only 2 copies of SMN2. Then what the FDA approval did, the FDA label came through as under 2 years of age and again with no restrictions. So it includes all copy numbers of SMN2 and all types of SMA as well. So that's the difference between the trials and the label. And now we're going to have to see where do the policies land between those two ranges. So the next slide is obviously, this is very early on. This is something, again, that we'll be updating constantly. We'll have this available on our website. This is where we're going to track all of the individual policies that come out from the commercial providers and then each of the Medicaid state programs as well. What we look for is the policies as they come out, how do they match up to the FDA label with, again, all these criteria under 2 years of age, but then also specifically copy number and types as well. What kind of restrictions might they put in there? A few things to note. So when there is a policy out there, if there is a restriction, it isn't definitely a no. It isn't something to give up on. We as SMA are always going to be kind of pushing back and doing advocacy to try to push policies right to the FDA label. But individually as well, it isn't an automatic no. I think as well, when there isn't necessarily a policy available publicly, that doesn't mean that approvals are not happening. That's much more on a case-by-case basis, and you're still going to potentially get approval. This is just kind of what gets put in place over time when eventually the providers will put out these formal policies. So we do have one, sorry, Megan, if you want to go back. We do have one policy out there, and we just wanted to highlight how this is going to go over time. It's very early, it's only one, so I don't think we want to kind of jump too far ahead and look at this as kind of how everything's going to play out. But the policies will come in and they will talk about if they're going to be up to 2 years of age. The one that we've seen so far from United Health is not 100% clear on that they are looking potentially to put specific criteria in place over 6 months of age. They may do it, but it's a little bit more uncertain of what they cover there. Their policy is calling out specifically type 1, not the other types, but they are a little broader on the copy numbers where they're saying they will cover copies 1, 2, 3 of SMN2, but restricting 4 copies. And then, Mary, do you want to say anything on those other two categories? These, again, are kind of those gray areas that we were saying we've got to pay attention to of how they're covered.
So one of the things that I would comment about is that it's very important to request prior approvals. As kind of stated, many policies may be kept internal or private at this point, but they may be developing them. So it's important for providers to submit those prior authorizations to the insurances, because not only will you find out more about what they are covering, not covering, or how they are managing it, but then may also push them to develop their policies.
Hi, everyone. This is Megan Lenz again. I do want to acknowledge that we are at the top of the hour. We're going to go ahead and keep going. We have a little bit more information that we want to share with you, so hopefully you can hang out for another 10 or 15 minutes.
And we'll try to get as many questions as we can towards the end within the time here. But we are shifting, I think, a little bit in the presentation now to what we say is kind of not included in the label. And this is, I know, a lot of the questions that are around in the community. If you're not in the label, if you're not going to be covered by insurance policy for this IV approach, what's happening next? Where will gene therapy potentially move to over the next couple of months, couple of years? So here we're talking, I think, about the intrathecal approach in particular. That this is the approach, rather than intravenous throughout the whole body, this is the injection right into the spinal cord that puts the gene therapy right into the spinal cord with the motor neurons. That's the intrathecal approach. I think there's some specific reasons for why there's a different approach here and why it's being looked at for older, bigger patients. And I think primarily it's because as you get bigger, when you're looking at the IV approach, you've got to put more and more of the vector of the gene therapy into the body as you get bigger. And at some point, that just gets too much. That load of the vector and the gene therapy going into the body, you're starting to potentially have issues that are going to crop up with the liver, with immune response. And so at some point, when you're talking about age or more here size, you want to switch to this different approach, which puts the gene therapy right just into the spinal cord where you know you definitely need it. But then you can actually have a smaller amount that goes into the body. So there's the trial that's going on, and we heard about it before. This is the STRONG trial that's up and running. So again, it is the intrathecal approach, not intravenous. And here it's going from about 6 months of age up to 60 months, 5 years. With 3 copies of SMN2. Those are the criteria. That's who's being looked at in this trial. I think what we would look at for the timing here, again, it's going to depend on getting recruitment completed and then flowing out from actually then kind of letting the study take place. Our expectations are that this could then conclude sometime towards the end of 2020 or into the start of 2021. What this is actually going to do is primarily going to depend on the data. I think that's the big thing here. That's the timing, but the result that would come out from this in terms of an FDA label, potentially approval for this intrathecal approach for older patients is going to depend on whether the data is good enough. And we always say this, there's no guarantees with these trials. So again, that should be an expectation. The data is going to kind of dictate what happens next. You could see the FDA coming in and looking at this with good data to say, yes, now here's an approval for the intrathecal approach for gene therapy, and maybe covering specifically the criteria that are here. We'd hope, again, all types or copy numbers, but maybe this could come in and cover this broader age range up to 5 years of age. There's a chance, I think, if the data is really good, again, you'd hope that maybe the FDA does what they've done in the past and go beyond the criteria in the trial. So could they come in if the data is strong enough and go beyond 5 years of age for all types and all copy numbers? We don't know. It'll depend on the data. And I think, and again, this is just us talking, this is our perspective. I think it's pretty a stretch to see the FDA going all ages just from this trial. They hopefully will go broader than just the 5 years, but whether they're going to go all the way up and into adults just from this trial, I think is probably a stretch and probably not the right expectation to have. I don't know, Mary, if you want to comment on that.
I agree with Kenneth. We need the information from the clinical trial to determine who will benefit from this therapy through this intrathecal approach. We just don't have enough information right now. So we're looking forward to those results becoming available.
And I think the data, what we hear is the data from this trial as well is going to influence a potentially additional trial. The data that comes out from this strong trial, and it's being looked at right now, looking at designing the trial that I think a lot of people have heard about that could be called REACH. That's a potential trial that then could have older patients. It would be this intrathecal approach, but with older patients in. So that's still in the planning stages. It's, again, going to depend on the data that comes out from strong. That, I think, then could be the trial that has the potential to go even older, bigger patients than the approval that could come from the strong trial. So the next slide, we wanted to highlight this issue, and we've been saying this for a while. We want to make sure that, again, this is in everybody's mind when they're thinking about gene therapy here. And very broadly, what we're really saying is timing is the critical issue. That it's been that way in SMA for a long time when we're even talking about care, when we're talking about treatment. Timing, getting on treatment is really the most important factor, and this is the perspective of Cure SMA. So what we think is, it's very important for all of you as individuals and with your physicians and neurologists to look at all the data that's available, look at the safety data, look at the efficacy data, evaluate the methods of administration that we're talking about here, intravenous, intrathecal. Also bear in mind, and I think, beyond the medical side, look at practical issues. You've got to kind of look through the insurance issues and potential timing there and weigh all that up. I think you're going to get a lot of information from the company. You're going to get a lot of information from us as Cure SMA, and we're going to try to make sure that all that information is there, available. We always look to take a neutral and biased position in these, but we're not going to and really not kind of tell you what to do. We're going to make sure that you have the information to make your own personal choice with your physician. But the one thing that we really do stress very strongly is timing is important. That what we want to say is you definitely should be evaluating all the options. You should look at all this data, look at what's available to you now, which could be treatment, it could be a trial option, but don't put off something now for a potential future better option. That's the key thing that we stress. Don't wait for something in the future when you've got a treatment or a trial option that's available now.
Yes. And as we're working through the insurance approvals for Zolgensma, that possibly for you and your situation may not be the best first choice right now. So again, don't wait. Work closely with your team, medical team, to determine what the best treatment is today.
And again, as I think I was saying with the trial, there's no guarantees here on the trials that are going on. We don't know how those are going to play out. And again, timing is such a critical issue that you want to start treatment. It's so much more important in SMA to stop further damage as soon as you can. It's very difficult to repair damage after the fact compared to preventing further damage going forward. So timing is really the critical issue.
As you consider treatment with Zolgensma as you've heard, it's so important to be aware of these cautions that are listed on the slide. There's a risk of liver injury, and this is managed by checking liver tests with blood work prior to starting therapy, and then after, and then to try to prevent liver injury, there's treatment with prednisolone that started a day before the infusion starts and continued through the following months up to in 2 months or possibly even longer. Additional blood tests are also obtained prior to starting therapy. If there's abnormal results, Zolgensma treatment may be delayed. It's also possible that it may not be safe to give to individuals. This is, again, so important to work with your SMA specialty healthcare team regarding these concerns. Following treatment and indefinitely, we recommend continued follow-up with your SMA medical team. They will monitor for symptoms of SMA, the side effects of treatment. They will help guide you to optimize the benefits of therapy, because we want to see everyone just get the most out of this therapy. And your medical team will also keep you informed about new information related to SMA. So following treatment, the close monitoring will include continued blood tests, monitoring for the liver function test, monitoring platelet count, monitoring the troponin 1 levels. And again, prednisone is used to prevent liver injury. But if there is evidence of liver injury or concern prior to starting therapy, this may not be the best therapy. At 30 days after treatment, if liver functions are still abnormal, the prednisolone course may be extended. It, again, just requires close follow-up. And it's also really important to know that you cannot just stop prednisone. It needs to be tapered off. Stopping it without that taper can result in other complications.
So this next slide, this is the first time that we've kind of pulled this slide together. So I think we'll see if we can kind of go through this. It's interesting, I think, when we're pulling the slide together, even though we're now in this stage where we actually have 2 options, it can get pretty complicated just with 2 options. And I think we wanted to highlight some of the issues that we're talking about in the choices that have to be made, and in particular here, how it can get complicated when one of the big questions that's out in the community starts to get thought about with not just one or the other treatment, but sequential treatment. Can you take one and then the other? And eventually, what are the potentials to have 2 treatments going on at the same time? So I think before we dive in, we might tie ourselves in knots as we kind of start to figure all this out for the first time. But I think one of the key things that we wanted to say again is don't let the complications, the decisions that you've got to make here when you're starting to think about the future and potential sequential or combination factors delay you on what your decisions are today. We'll figure this out going forward, but again, timing is the key issue, and don't let some of these potential considerations of one after the other or both at the same time slow you down, delay getting a first treatment decision made. So that's kind of the big critical thing here. So what we are talking about, though, with having 2 treatments is making a choice between one treatment and the other. Something to bear in mind, I think, is to look at what could happen. Are you potentially then not going to be able to go on another treatment in the future? What we're also talking about is that the potential to start on one treatment and then move to a second. So this I wanted to kind of put out, this is what I'm kind of thinking of in terms of sequential, not combination. The complication I think here is when we're talking about a gene therapy and when we're talking about a treatment which is permanent, sequential might not ever actually apply. If you take something which is permanent first, there is no sequential. You're then automatically onto a combination when you take another treatment on top of that. And then there is, I think, is more traditionally called kind of the combination approach when you take 2 treatments at the same time. One of the critical factors here, I think, is the data part. And I think I was saying that up front, that, it's going to be very important for us as a community, for all of you as individuals, as in your family, with your physicians, to look at the data part of this. Because you really do need to make sure that when you're talking about sequential or combinations, there's a reason to do it, that there really is a benefit to taking 2 things. You're going to get more out of it than just one on its own. And I think the reason to do that, especially when you're talking about combinations, is the risks with combinations can go up. When you take 2 things now, you might get the risks from both of those at the same time, maybe with no additional benefit. But I think as well with combination aspects, there's often this potential for an interaction between the two treatments, and you might have new risks that could come up that were never there alone. So it's going to be important to look at this data, what the benefits might be, and what the risks are. And I think we're at a point where we don't have information from clinical trials on sequential or combinations. We don't, at this point, have real-world evidence either of people doing this through commercial approvals. That's a potential that's going to come over time. Right now, we really just have a few, what we're calling anecdotes, case studies, one-off cases. And I don't think we look at that as enough to really confidently say what the benefits or what the risks are. So we're not at a point where we have data for this area. I think importantly, it's not in the FDA label. The FDA hasn't seen this data. And then critically as well, it's going to be important for the insurance aspects, whether insurance policies are going to look at certain data out there and say they will cover two treatments, one after the other, or two treatments together. Data is going to be important for all of those decisions. Want to add anything? But again, I think this is something which will be developed over time. We're going to touch more on this topic again at the conference and at other symposiums and workshops, webinars that we do in the future. But I think as well, critically here, this is something that needs to have more data come in over time for us, primarily as a community, even beyond the FDA and insurance companies, for us as a community to know what this area means and the decisions that can be made when we're talking about sequential and combinations. But I think I did want to reiterate again, right now, yes, this is complicated, but this should not delay you in making a first choice now to get on treatment.
I just want to emphasize that, again, we're learning together. We're in a space that we've not been in before. So, again, it's just so important for you to continue to work with your medical team so that we can gather that information, help learn more, and share that information across the community.
So the next slide we have here, and again, these slides will be available, so you'll be able to get these links. This is where we're putting the information that we talked about from clinical trials available, the information on the sites that are publicly available, information on insurance coverage and how to approach that area. And then also we've got the email here, which you can certainly reach out to us on, definitely for treatment sites, but other questions as well about the treatments, about the data that's out there, and that's the treatments@curesma.org. So what we did want to try and do is try and shift to a few questions. I know we're over time, so we'll try and go through these quickly. And I think, again, this is going to be over time. We'll come back. We'll look at questions that have been submitted and making sure that we're getting this information and answers out to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kenneth and Mary. We'll try to go through just 4 or 5 questions right now. So the first question, and you touched on this a little bit, but what options or opportunities are going to be available for children over 2? And do we know when trials might begin in older children?
So here, I think it's going back to the slide talking about the clinical trial that's going on right now, the STRONG trial that has criteria which go up to the age of 5. The timing for that being, we think after recruitment's finished towards the end of next year, 2020, or the start of 21. And again, it's going to depend what the data is. Is the data good enough for all of us, FDA and insurance, to say, yes, this has a benefit for people over the age of 2. So that data's got to come out to determine it. Then as well is there a potential for another trial that could start based on the data from STRONG that would go even older than that 5 years of age. So that's the potential timing. It is when you're talking here, a year and a half out. And again, it is going to depend on something we just don't know yet, which is what is the data from those trials.
Great, thank you so much. So the next question is, do we know when Zolgensma might become available for adults, and do we think that adults will see the same results that children have seen?
So again, on the timing there, it is going to depend on these next trials, and I think, the expectation I was putting out is I think I'd be surprised if the FDA went broad into adults from the STRONG trial. There's a chance, again, if you've got really strong data, that the FDA would extrapolate and go that much broader, but how far will it go from just the age limit of 5 years and up? I think it's probably the expectation should be not from that trial up into adults for the intrathecal approach. It'll have to be this kind of next trial, the REACH one, where we don't know the criteria, we don't know when that's starting. So you could be talking 2-3 years out before we really start to kind of look at the real potential for adults for the intrathecal gene therapy.
I want to take this back to more of a pragmatic thing to think about, which is the number one thing is we don't know whether adults will benefit from this therapy, and we need to know that first. So we'll have more information after the STRONG trial is completed about that potential for older individuals to receive Zolgensma and whether it's beneficial. But that really is the bottom line, is will it help people? We only want you to get a therapy that's going to make this disease different for you.
So the next question is, so if an individual receives gene therapy, are they going to be able to either continue or begin to receive Spinraza as well?
So again, here it will depend on data, and we don't have data in this area on whether it's safe to do that, whether there's actually a point to doing that, is there a benefit? So that's data that we've got to collect. I think the critical issue here on whether it's going to be possible, though, not so much whether it makes sense, is going to be the insurance coverage. That's going to be the critical factor here. Will insurance come in and pay for what we're talking about here, which is kind of the sequential approach? Will insurance pay for the two treatments, essentially? If they pay for one already, will they pay for another? And it's certainly going to be a stretch. We haven't seen the policies coming out yet. We've seen one or two that are kind of almost been in draft mode, where the insurance companies are kind of hinting that they may cover a second treatment after the first, but with kind of strict criteria that they may say, the first treatment may have had to show that it stopped working, that a patient now is going downhill even though they're on the first treatment, and that would then have to be a trigger that's shown before a second treatment would be paid for. So my gut is I don't think it's going to be an outright no, but there's going to be strict criteria that the insurance companies want to see. They're going to want to see data saying not just, again, that there's a purpose, there's a benefit to taking two, but a first treatment that they might have paid for has for some reason stopped working or is not doing enough that it normally should do.
I expect that this will be a case-by-case basis until we have more real-world information. So our approach at SMA would be to ask the insurers, request a prior authorization.
And I think the question here as well is a little more subtle. It's kind of asking, can you continue on Spinraza and get gene therapy? There, I think it's probably going to be, until we get a lot more data, more clear-cut, that insurance is going to want you to stop. They're not going to want to kind of get involved in that risk side so much of being on the two right at the same time.
And so the last question is, since most of the babies in the trial did not have tracheostomies, do we think that that is going to be a limitation for insurance coverage?
At this point in time, I think yes, that it will be, because as we've been saying, Zolgensma doesn't bring back function in motor neurons that have already been injured and are not functioning. So that is probably it's an area that we don't know a lot about. We expect that will probably not, it'll be an exclusion criteria. We're hopeful that will be challenged and looked at more carefully, but right now we don't have information about individuals who are ventilator dependent.
And I think it is going to be a tough one as well. While it's kind of technically in the FDA label, it's one of those specific categories that they called out as a gray area, borderline. So with the FDA saying that, it kind of gives some strength to the insurance companies to then say they don't need to cover it. So I think that's probably going to be one of the most challenging areas to get answers on. And definitely kind of pushing back on the insurance, which certainly is worth doing, but it is going to be one of the tougher areas, I think, when the FDA has already kind of said that's a specific area that's an issue to watch out for.
We just don't know.
Thank you, Kenneth and Mary, so much for your time, and thank you again to the Avexis team for joining us today. We are well past our allotted time, so we're going to go ahead and end on that note. But again, to those of you who submitted questions during this webinar, we do have all those, and we'll be reviewing those and kind of using them to help guide our future communications. So thank you all so much for your time, and we look forward to speaking in the future.